Hello, Ken. Thank you so much for joining me. Please, can you introduce yourself, what you do, and your work, please?
I am Kennath Widanaralalage. I am a lecturer in psychology at King's College London. I am a researcher, I'm a psychologist, and I've been working in the area of sexual violence both as a student, but as my studies progressed, more involved from the research side of things. And I've always been very interested in understanding victims' experiences. That work has inevitably led to engaging with service providers across the UK and abroad, and victims from all sorts of backgrounds. My doctorate focused on men's experiences of sexual violence, particularly on men who were sexually assaulted, abused, or raped by other men. This work was quite interesting and challenging in many ways because of the nature of the work and the sensitivity of the topic means that a lot of men feel quite uncomfortable talking about this area of this part of their lives. And yeah, it has this interest and desire to work with these groups, especially those marginalized groups, has never decreased, so to speak. And so my recent work has focused more on what we would call ethnic minority groups in the UK. It's not particularly a nice phrase, but it easily conveys what and who I am referring to. And so in the last couple of years, I was fortunate enough to secure funding to do research with these groups and with these communities, particularly with South Asian men and with men of Black British heritage. So yeah, researcher interested in exploring and understanding sexual violence from the victim, but also from the perpetrator's perspective.
Okay, so interesting. When you said service providers, what does that mean?
So it's a very broad term to encapsulate all the organizations that interact with victims, and that can be mental health support services, that can be charities, but it can also be to some extent also the criminal justice system,
Hmm.
given the fact that all of these organizations are interlinked to some extent, whether it is, for example, sexual assault referral centers, whether it's charities who have links with particular criminal justice settings, that sort of stuff.
Okay, really interesting. And where would you say what comments would you like to make on male sexual violence with regards to maybe you could start with society and kind of where we're at with that discussion compared to maybe where we were at 10 years ago?
That's an interesting. I mean, it's something I've been reflecting on over the last couple of weeks, months, or at least in the last year, because I do think that there has been a significant change in, even simply speaking, people's ability to accept and understand what we mean by saying that men can also be victims of sexual violence. I think the push towards recognizing that also men have problems in relation to their mental health helps and has helped significantly in making the experiences of men who are survivors of sexual violence more salient, surely more than it was 10 years ago. And we had a number of high profile cases which have helped is the wrong, it's not the
I
best way,
understand.
the best way of putting it, but has certainly facilitated
Mm.
a better a broader, more open public conversation of men who are victims of sexual violence. There's still a lot of work to do because the stereotypes that exist around being a man are certainly still there. Men struggle with seeking help. Men struggle with recognizing themselves as victims because of all the societal pressures that we and others put on ourselves in terms of being, strong, resilient, assertive in all sorts of manners, whether it's in our professional lives, with our friends, with our partners, and this idea that men are always seeking out sexual interaction. It's hard to dispel, and it has a lot of implication for survivors when they become victim of sexual violence and have to make sense of all of these societal pressures and taboos around even simply having honest conversations around what consent is. We are moving towards the right direction, but the evidence suggests that men still are very reluctant to seek support, and they are very reluctant to involve important institutions such as the criminal justice system. So things have improved, but not as fast as we and as with the scale that we need.
Absolutely. So you use the term sexual violence. Now, that would indicate to me that there's some form of force or attack. Is that the case? Because my understanding is when we use the term sexual abuse, that is kind of like broadly any type of grooming, manipulation, contact, non-contact. So is sexual violence an umbrella holding different things?
Um, Again, I think if you ask different people, they will give you different answers. And I think perhaps when we refer to sexual abuse, there is more of a coercive, organized, and repeated pattern to it, which is some of the things that you described in
Yeah.
terms of the grooming elements, in terms of the coercive elements, often seen in particular in relation with minors. So I would say the
Mm,
sexual violence probably is the umbrella term that would encapsulate the abusive experiences, the assault one-off incidents,
mm,
the rape incidents, and so on
mm,
and so forth. But I think it's terminology and definitions are just as useful up to a
mm,
specific
mm.
point. It's really interesting, especially when we talk about men, how often everyone comes with their own definitions, and everyone comes to their own ways of using different terms to explain their experiences. And it's quite interesting that how powerful that can is for survivors who have undergone particular journeys, maybe engage with mental health services, how powerful that is for them to take back control of horrible phrase, but take some
Mm,
sort of
mm,
control over their past experiences.
mm. So are you working predominantly with people who have uh, um, been victims of sexual violence in their adulthood?
No, I have worked with both adult victims, adolescent victims, and childhood
Okay.
men who have childhood sexual abuse experiences.
Right. Okay. And I mean, one of the things I think would be just generally confusing for people to get a hold of would be, well, how can a man experience sexual violence when they're in their adulthood? Surely they would just be able to fend like physically move that person off of them, you know. Is that am I anywhere close to anything there?
Um, as in, so the idea of resistance,
Mm,
or the ability of a victim to resist, it's something that's quite commonly a trope that's quite commonly used, not only for male victims but also for female victims.
yes.
It's this idea that because we think that as individuals we have agency in our lives, when we encounter situations in which another person is subject to experiences that wouldn't want on ourselves, we then try to justify how the events have occurred.
Right.
And there is a psychological motivation to, rather than focusing on the perpetrator, which means focusing on the actions of the perpetrators means taking away power and agency from the person, and instead focusing on the victim helps understand, well, identifying all the ways in which the victim could have behaved in a different way
Mm,
helps the person understand or imagine a situation in which if they were in that place they
mm,
wouldn't become victims themselves.
mm.
It's something that's called, it's known as a defensive attribution
Okay.
process, in which
Okay.
you look at the victim and identify all of the behaviors and characteristics of the victim that you think may have caused the assault, when in reality uh, that has very little to do with the sexually violent and sexually deviant action of a perpetrator.
Mm, mm,
So when you raise the question of people would be confused of considering male adults as potential victims, I think it more focuses on our stereotypes around what we think we would do if we
Mm.
were in that
Right.
situations, and don't recognize the reality of a lot of this sexually violent events,
Right.
that they happen with partners. They
Mm.
happen in contexts in which there is a power imbalance between the perpetrator and the victim.
Yeah.
They happen in situations where perhaps there is impaired capacity from the victim, and there is the very famous Reina Tsinaga case from Manchester from a couple of years ago. I don't know if you are familiar
No.
with this.
No.
Considered one of the most prolific rapists in the UK. He would essentially hunt men in Manchester, bring them back to his flat, drug them, and then sexually abuse them and rape them, and film all of those instances. That is an example of men who, most in most cases, people would consider them to be, perfectly capable of defending themselves. But there is more to. It's as soon as we start looking at the perpetrators and the actions of the perpetrator and the circumstances in which sexual violence occurs, the less important all of those considerations about
Yeah.
the victim become. It's not, and it's this idea of strength. It's such an interesting one, because we have been brought up to believe that
Yes.
a man is measured by his strength, both
Yes.
mental and physical.
Mm.
But that especially when it comes to, and perpetrators can be male perpetrators and there can be female
Mm.
perpetrators, and the literature is very interesting in this space as well. There is a substantial number of men who are victims from female perpetrators of sexual violence. It happens within the relationship. There is coercive elements. There is impaired capacity components. There is a really strong coercive element there as well. Strength and resistance have very little to do in
Mm.
those circumstances.
Mm. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I just learned a lot from you just since I just asked you that question. So thanks. Did you see Baby Reindeer?
I did, yes.
Okay. What were your views on the way it got a male on male situation of sexual violence out into the public? Were you pleased with the way they represented it?
I think overall, yes, it was. I think I had my reservations on the aftermath in terms of how quickly people identified the potential, well, the perpetrator, the Marta character, and I had my reservations around how the story was described as a real story, but then the
Mm.
case didn't actually go to court. If
Yeah.
I'm correct, so my reservations are mainly in terms of the delivery, and I think they're more with Netflix than Richard Gad, because the story in itself is incredibly powerful. And I remember watching the series, well, what was it, a couple of months ago, I think, at this
Yeah.
point, and feeling like I was going back to some of my first interviews with male victims who were telling me all very, very similar things in terms of being in those positions where there was a power imbalance between them and the perpetrator, where substances were used, where capacity was impaired, and where the situation was such where often perpetrators seem not to recognize themselves as such,
Mm.
and where the victim is left on his own devices, not fully understanding what and how is happening, and that process of realization was so powerfully captured. And I think it speaks to the fact that Richard Gad is a male victim of sexual violence from another male perpetrator. That was really, really powerful. I think it's one of those where it's definitely a recommended watch for survivors who are seeking a way of seeing their story represented in the media.
Mm. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I thought it was very powerful. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the common things that you have realized or founded or understood through interviewing so many male survivors of sexual violence?
It's hard to pinpoint a maybe that's something that I learned. It's how different every
Mm.
story can be, and how unique a lot of the experiences are, and how unique. I told you at the beginning, right, about this idea of men using language in very unique ways to describe themselves, the events, and rationalize and trying to explain their story to a complete stranger such as myself. Research is an interesting dynamic because I'm not a therapist, I'm not qualified to provide therapeutic support in any capacity, because I am a psychology in its more traditional sense as someone who studies the subject. And it's quite interesting to see, however, the similarities in terms of their stories. Whilst men can be victims of a single perpetrator, multiple perpetrators, it can be a once-off event, it can be a repeated event, it can happen with someone they know, a stranger, a partner, a parent, a caregiver. So the stories are so different. Some of the reactions tend to be relatively similar. There are some similarities in what the story looks like afterwards. A lot of the time, what I seem to know, what I noticed is it takes time to realize what has happened is, and finding the words to call what
Mm.
has happened sexually violent. I don't want to speculate and draw comparison with female victims because I don't think it's fair or particularly useful, to be completely honest. But I think the readiness of our society to, accept that women are a disproportionately affected by sexual violence means that women are perhaps more better equipped. That's as far as I'm willing to go to recognize something as violent. Whereas because of how we are socialized, and men were were using those words in describing their experiences. Who would believe me? How could I understand that what was happening was I was being raped? And especially in those circumstances similar to the Richard Gutt story, where capacity is impaired, where it's someone who is in a powerful position, someone who has more power than you, who seems to be more experienced than you. That was such a common story for male survivors that I've encountered, where there's an element of inability, or well, inability is the wrong word, of unwillingness to recognize that they were victims. And victim is such a difficult word to digest for someone who identifies as a man, because we are not supposed to be victims. We're not supposed to be defenseless or in need of support. We need to sort everything out by ourselves and recover by ourselves, or any setback. My PhD was titled A Solitary Place because it felt like being a male survivor was quite a solitary place for
Wow.
men, in the sense that men felt really alone at the beginning, at least, whilst they were making sense of their experiences. They felt quite lonely, and it was quite lonely not only in terms of because you can be surrounded by people with the best of intentions, but a lot of the time, not a lot of people are not equipped to provide the level of even just an empathetic and willing to listen. Listening, it's really hard, and that's what a lot of survivors found in terms of people around them not really offering just the opportunity to sit down and talk through their experiences, but this tendency of treating men with, oh, here's a solution, here's a thing that you should do so that you're going to feel better. This is what you do, where you go, da. Whereas a lot of the time it takes time, and time is often not given to men to look after themselves. It's always, yeah, this has happened. You now get back to your feet. You do A, B, and C, and everything is going to be fine. And then if that's not going to be fine, you're going to do something else and something else. Whereas time is the best cure for healing. Is probably not the best way of describing it, but at least moving forward. So I don't think I've really answered your
It's
question in
no
terms
problem.
of
Like, it's all interesting things.
similarity. But yes, I think challenges around recognizing are really, really predominant in the male accounts, whether there were childhood experiences, well, particularly when there were childhood experiences, but also for adults, because of the circumstances which adult sexual violence tends to happen. This is valid for all sexual violence. The stranger rape scenario of a stranger jumping out of a bush is very it occurs, but it's not the predominant experience. It often happens within intimate relationship. It often happens where there is a level of trust with the perpetrator,
Mm.
whether there is a partner or someone in a position of power, like a caregiver or a teacher for the more
Mm.
adolescent or childhood experiences. So the challenge of recognition are really clear. What's really also clear for men is their challenges in seeking support, because, and this is again linked with the challenges in recognizing themselves as someone in needing of help. And so something that was quite common across male survivors is this tendency to almost overcompensate for the trauma by engaging in stereotypically masculine behavior. And what are the stereotypically masculine behavior? Drinking,
Mm.
having promiscuous sex, getting out of your way to get into fights, being quite argumentative and competitive. A minority manage to do that in a healthy way. Others don't, and that has all sorts of repercussions. And in fact, very rarely, at least in my experience, men immediately found themselves with the specialist support with the type of organizations that I work with. They often end up talking to a GP. They often end up talking to a counselor for other related problems, or for a substance abuse and use clinic. And then the trauma sort of seeps through, and that process of recognition happens almost in a roundabout way, if that makes sense.
Oh wow.
Um,
Do you know what? That thing that you just said about reclaiming your masculinity because you feel like it was stripped away from you by another male,
mm.
that just made my
or or
mind blow.
or female.
Okay.
That applies as well, because of stereotypes exist regardless of who the perpetrator
Right.
is, and a lot of the time we live in a world where stereotypes are not they're just mental schemas that we use to make quick judgments in the social world. And so that we use stereotypes all the time, whether we want or not. We have a
Mm.
stereotype about what a librarian is. This is a
Yeah.
classic example, right?
Yeah.
So you see someone who is well dressed with glasses in a library, you're going to assume that they are a library. It's a stereotype. It's a
Yeah.
quick judgment schema
Mm.
that you use. And so you see a man walking down the street who is well built, you are going to be alert in that case, because it's a
Mm.
stereotype of the schema of a dangerous person in a dark alley.
Mm.
And so schemas are inevitable, and stereotypes are inevitable because we use them all the time. We are
Mm.
quite lazy in
Mm.
in processing information. And so regardless of who the perpetrator is, the schemas and the stereotypes around what it is to be a man and how a man is supposed to behave are, well, there is a strong conflict with the stereotypes about being a victim. And so that
Right.
plays a role in, a victim is weak, gullible, and defenseless and need the
Right.
support. A man is strong, resilient, assertive, and capable of solving everything. And those two things, when they're happening at the same time, there is a conflict, and this conflict becomes, for a lot of male survivors, psychological.
Okay, so now this is getting really interesting. So I've never really thought of that concept before. Um, everything, the nature of being a victim is in conflict with the nature of, do we use the word masculinity? I'm not sure. Being a man, or
Sure.
what we're expected to be as a man. So does that mean when you do become a victim of sexual violence, that's why many will feel like their masculinity has been stripped from them?
I think so. I think there is. I'm always going to preface every answer with it depends, it varies,
Of
and
course.
all survivors have a very very unique journey. But in my experience with the survivors that I talk to, a lot of the time this idea of masculinity, a challenge to their masculinity, seems very very predominant, because of I heard of survivors who thought that they needed to drink and get into fights to sort of reassert themselves in their life, as in, I am strong, I can defend themselves. That was a sort of one-off event. This is not going to happen again to me. I'm not going to let it happen again to me,
Right.
by acting in those, and self-admitted and self-confessed, the stereotypically masculine ways. There is a note here, because something else that I noticed when working with male survivors is, while some might take quite an externalizing approach to their trauma, to their to their psychological well-being or in search of psychological well-being, others do also have a tendency to quite internalize very, very strongly. There is men who bottle everything up, and I've come across survivors who it took them 15, 20 years to come to, to come to their realization that something had happened, and that something was, that one time in that particular relationship, or that particular parent or caregiver who acted in a certain way. So I think it's an important part to note, this idea of some go out of their way to reassert themselves, whereas others strongly internalize, and it has all sorts of ramification in terms of their mental health and well-being.
Okay, so I'm wondering which one, if any, of course. But if I, if I, which one was it that I went down? Because I've never
Sure.
heard the concept of re-establishing or taking back your masculinity by asserting yourself and being competitive and wanting to
Mhm.
succeed and show everyone that you are a man. Because I was very competitive and ambitious as a young man, so possibly I went down that road. But also, I bottled it up for 20 years and didn't say anything until
Sure.
I was 27 years old, right? Finished when I was about 10 years old, so 17 years. In your research, speaking to people that have been through this, um, are they giving any indication of, or do you know of, why it's taking males like myself so long to? It's not so much, and this is so confusing for the general public. I mean, how could they ever get their head around it if they haven't
Mhm.
been either in the field like yourself or been through it
Sure.
themselves? Um, and I understand that. So was it I don't think it was that I just didn't tell anyone or I kept it to myself. I think my brain didn't even really look at it in any way.
Sure.
It just, I don't know, what did it do? Just threw it away for some time until I was of an age where I was like, okay, let's take a look at this. In your interviews with victims, male victims, are they giving any indication of why this is happening commonly? It's taking so long for males to come forward to even just really recognize what they went through in their adolescence or childhood was so
Mhm.
terrible.
Um, I mean, I think your experience speaks to it in the way that you just described it, as a lot of survivors told the survivors who explicitly stated that they just bottled it up and just didn't look at it. They just,
Mm.
I think there was a really, really powerful way a survivor described it once, as if putting it in a box and just hiding the box in the the deepest recess of
Yeah,
my mind, and never, never, ever, ever look at it, but knowing at the back of my head that there was this box
yeah,
pulsating and dragging me, or weighing on my on my conscious, on my heart, whatever, on my mind, whatever expression
yeah.
works for the individual. And there are a number of reasons why might that be the case, and a lot of times speaks to developmental issues and traumas, where our mind is designed to protect us, and to protect us from things that are we are not supposed to experience, we're not supposed to understand, because they are beyond our abilities from a cognitive perspective. Now,
Mm.
as a child of 10, you're not supposed to have sexual relation. Well, you're not supposed to. It's against our, it's deviant in any possible
Right.
definition, having a sexual relation with an adult, regardless of whether it's an issue of consent or not.
Yeah.
It's a child and an adult, and there are um, clear deviancy associated with those issues. And so, whilst I can't offer a specific answer to your case or to any other's case, because
Yeah.
it's psychologically so profound, I think there is an element of self protection and self
Mm.
defense involved, in which making sense of something so traumatic and so devastating is psychologically impossible at the time. And so removing yourself and pushing that aside helps coping and helps pushing that away as far as possible. Inevitably, because of this idea of that it's somewhere in the back of your head,
Mm.
of your mind, it's impossible to stay away from it forever.
When we talk about these abusive situations in childhood
Yeah.
where the child is and I'm speaking mostly from my own experience, the child
Yeah,
is
of course.
participating in some way.
Hmm.
Um, they're not resisting. They've been groomed and manipulated.
Yeah.
Does the I don't know whether you're informed to answer this question. If you're not, that's obviously no problem. But does the trauma actually happen at that time, or does the trauma happen when you become an adult and you look back at how you were treated?
I'm. It's very difficult for me to answer that, and I probably can't give you a straight answer because I don't think anyone knows or
Right.
anyone can. It's one of those things where how could you possibly measure when and how?
Yeah.
Uh, it's very very difficult to pinpoint. You can't give a score to trauma, or rather, you can't give at point zero you
Yeah.
were at zero trauma, and then at point one you were at 50% trauma.
Yeah.
It's a very roundabout way of making this point. So, but I can only give you my personal opinion here. I think that an element happens, if not straight away, as the abuse progresses,
Mm,
and as the child reminisces and started to make sense of something that happened and it was not supposed to happen. And because
mm,
we have to also remember what grooming involves. There is trust involved, there is secrecy involved, and you're told not to tell anyone, for example, potentially. You're told that this is our little secret. These are the type of phrases that perpetrators and abusers use to coerce and to maintain the deviant assault and the sexual violence secret.
mm,
All of this will stay with you in some capacity or another, because then you will have to associate those sexual relations, whatever and however they looked like, whether you participated or you didn't participate, as something that was, if not wrong, something that was between you and this other person. And so whether trauma, it again, we might have stereotypes around trauma as something that hurts you straight away, like someone is pinching you, right?
yes.
It's far more complex than that.
Yes.
And so in that sense, in recognizing the complexity of what trauma actually looks like, my personal view is that it probably happens quite quite quickly, rather than being just a retrospective
Yeah.
view of what has happened.
Mm,
That said, that retrospective view gives you the magnitude of the trauma, doesn't
mm,
it? Because
mm.
you then can look back and you start piecing things together,
Yes.
because you start piecing things together and you start using your adult cognition, your adult fully developed brain, who knows
Mm,
what's right and what's wrong, to start recognizing how things that you thought were okay actually weren't. And there is trauma there as well, when you have to rewrite your childhood stories.
yep. And when you start looking at yourself as a child, which when you think about yourself as a 6 year old, an 8 year old, a 10 year old, you feel
Yeah,
love for that child. When
of
you see
course.
photos of yourself in your younger years, you feel love for who you were, your innocence. And then, yes, as you say, when you're of maturity to reflect on what happened,
Yeah,
and you have the development to, you really start feeling sorry for who
absolutely.
you were. Uh, can you speak about possible complexities and confusions that being abused in your childhood or adolescence by another male when you are a male brings to your view on your sexuality, or anything around that?
Mm. Um, Again, quite a common question that is brought up by childhood sexual abuse survivors are questions around their sexuality, and this is something that comes across from both survivors and the service providers. I've also done research with service providers because I
Okay.
was very interested in seeing this dual perspective of a horrible phrase, the service user and those who provide support, right? So
Okay.
those who access mental health support services and the people who provide that support. And this idea of questioning sexuality, of sexual fantasies that were very very difficult to reconcile, particularly in adulthood, was very dominant, was very 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 predominant. I think it speaks to two things. The first one is, again, that the healthy coping mechanism for men is to be sexually active, and that sexual element is seen as a way of making sense of development. Again, stereotypes around, young boys, the only thing they're in their mind is, porn and masturbation, to put it quite bluntly.
Yeah.
And so that idea of exploration through the means of sex, which, in some extent it probably is a healthy thing,
Mm-hmm.
because of the childhood experiences that a person or an adolescent, the childhood or adolescent experiences that some survivors have, will inevitably trigger something, that exploratory process. And so questions around sexuality are very common. It's hard to say exactly why that is. From a psychological point of view, the best offer that I can make, or the best explanation I can make, is this idea of exploring and then referring back to things that you actually experienced.
Mm.
Many survivors report arousal. Many survivors report
Yeah.
ejaculation as
Yeah.
well in their experiences, which doesn't actually mean actual arousal. It's a very common fear response,
Oh.
which tends to be overlooked. Yeah, there is really interesting research from both the animal and human world around ejaculation as a fear response
Oh,
in
wow.
certain instances of what's described as tonic immobility. So this inability to like a freeze response when sexually assaulted, and people reporting arousal and what looks like arousal and seems like pleasure, but it's more of a fear response more than anything else. And so all of that, I know this because I read it up in really obscure papers from the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000.
Mm.
But people are not expected to, and this is not common knowledge, and people are
Mm.
not telling us this type of information as we are kids, because
Yeah.
no one wants to talk about sexual violence when we are children. And so the
Mm.
questions around sexuality, the sexual fantasies that cause discomfort to some survivors, I think are linked to this traumatic memories, and using those traumatic memories as the base point for that sexual exploration and development of sexual identity, which is part of our adolescent development as well.
I think it's, again, another confusing thing for society to
I mean,
hear.
it's confusing. I mean, it's confusing
That good
for
point.
us as well.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very difficult to reconcile. The only thing that we can trust is the data and the science behind it.
Mm.
This happens, and so once we understand that sexual arousal is a fear, can be a fear response in certain
Yeah,
circumstances, or can
yeah.
be a response that is natural and not designed, and doesn't mean anything else other than the circumstances in which you were in,
Mm.
then it's easier to make sense of questions around sexuality, or questions around sexuality and
Right.
questions around sexual fantasies. But
Mm.
again, because these conversations are not openly held, a lot of child sexual abuse and adolescent sexual abuse victims are left to their own devices to try and make sense of a lot of stuff that it's very, very hard to
Right.
talk about and make
Right.
sense of.
Right.
And that is particularly true for, and this perhaps speaks to your case, to your story as well, when you're from an ethnic minority group,
Yeah.
because our communities are not expected to talk about this stuff. And that's nothing, and it's not about blaming communities, it's not about blaming cultures, it's just what it is. And you can't, these are not conversations that are openly and readily held, and so all the problems that come with that.
So your research in with ethnic minority groups, you are seeing the journey for a survivor to be extremely challenging because of the stigma and taboo is much more increased compared to, let's say, more westernized cultures. Is that correct?
I mean, I want to try and avoid perhaps creating a scale of
Right.
survivors. I
Right.
don't know, for the very reason that sexual violence is traumatic enough without me coming along and creating a hierarchy of who has it worse.
I
Because,
like that. Yes, I
but
agree with
that
you.
said, it's very true that the challenges for individuals who grew up in a community in which sex and mental health are absolute taboos, in which you don't talk about that with anyone, let alone your parents,
Mm.
and where, again, because of the nature of the research I've done, it can be a little bit more one-to-one experiences, so I don't have a macro view of all the survivors or a representative sample. But that said, a lot of the abuse happens within those communities for South Asian men, for example, particularly for Asian and South Asian communities. It
Mm,
happens quite often within their communities. It might be someone who is well-respected member of the community. It might be a family friend.
yeah.
It might be a close family friend. It could be a sibling. It could be a parent, and so that creates. And whilst that it's not unique of South Asian communities, because I've encountered uh, white survivors who also had this type of experiences, I think that there is a cultural element to it that it's under recognized and under discussed, because of this community element. It's very hard to breach and to bring this research and to bring this conversation to
Yeah.
South Asian communities,
Yeah.
because no one wants to talk
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the fact that there are respected members of their communities who are acting at the very least acting
Yes.
inappropriately, at the very worst abusing children in the
Yes.
community.
What are you looking to unearth or discover, or what is driving your direction in your research?
I think at first, I'll be honest and straightforward. I think at first it was quite an academic exercise.
Okay.
At the beginning, it was an interesting topic. I've always been interested in the idea of mental health and stereotypes and this type of area of research. But the encounters that I had with survivors converted me to actually something a little bit. I personally feel, at least, something a little bit more profound.
Okay.
As the survivors that I've come across are the on yeah, and again, it's one-to-one. Once it happens one time, interviews that last 2 hours sometimes.
Yeah.
The most incredible people I've ever met in my life, in
Mm.
terms of the resilience, the strength, the courage, the vulnerability, the ability to be so vulnerable with a complete stranger, which I think me being a stranger, it's probably quite liberating,
Yes.
because I'm never going to see you again, so
Yes.
I'm just going to put it all out there and just be me,
Yes.
because I'm not gonna be yourself myself, because I'm not gonna see you ever again.
Mm.
And so these encounters have pushed me towards wanting to do more and to learn more, and to raise awareness as much as possible about their experiences through research. And yeah, I think that's
Yeah. Yeah.
my goal, I guess.
And when we've mentioned a little bit about adolescents,
Mm.
I'm putting together training programs for schools, right? So I go in to speak with teachers. I'm doing one at the start of next month. I'm making some big changes to my talk because I'm just learning. Like I will
Sure.
I will watch and listen to this a number of times once it goes out, and I'm making more adjustments. I'm wondering about adolescence, right? So, and by the
Mm.
way, I know we planned originally when we chatted before this recording that we were going to start talking about offenders, but I mean, let's just continue on the pathway that we're
Sure.
going. We
Sounds
can
good, man.
meet, we can meet again, no problem. So adolescence. So 13, 14, 15, 16 year olds.
Yeah.
Have you had much interaction with people who went through crime at that age? And the reason why I ask you is because I often think, like, I was prepubescent when this happened to me, right?
Mm.
Between ages 8 and 10. So, in some ways, I felt, and for anybody that's listening to this, by the way, that was uh, exploited or manipulated during those adolescent ages, I'm not trying to take anything like down, question your experience in any way. What I'm trying to say is, in the prepubescent ages, your defense is almost less, I would say, in some way, because you're not mature. But as you go into your teenage years, especially as a boy, like what I was experiencing, testosterone starts pumping around your body. You've got a bit more aggression about you. You're older. So I'm really wondering how I'm supposed to represent sexual violence against a teenage boy in my training. And obviously, I'm not asking you to answer that. What I'm asking is, can you please talk a little bit about teenagers who were um, sexually abused or experienced sexual violence in any way? It's completely open.
Yeah, I mean, my very first piece of research focused on experiences um, after the age of 13. So
Okay.
it kind of falls in
Okay.
their remit. So I have worked quite extensively with men who were abused or sexually assaulted within in that time
Mm.
bracket, 13, 16. And there are, I think it's such a interesting point that you make in terms of, this idea of my defenses perhaps are not as developed when I'm prepubescent.
Yeah.
They might start developing in that age, and you're probably right from a cognitive perspective. You might be more closer to an adult than to a child in
Yes.
that 13, 14, 15, 16. And
Yes.
maturity becomes it's a different conversation. Maturity when it comes to more being a effective agent in the social world, if you want.
Mm.
But when it comes to sex, when it comes to consent, when it comes to grooming, I think much of the same applies in
Wow.
terms of power. It's all about power, isn't it? And and
Yeah.
often is about powerful people taking advantage of our, you know, of potentially the lack of a capable guardian around us,
Yes.
and of all of our vulnerabilities at a very critical time, because those 13 to 16 are crucial, and you can find, it's very well documented for our development in terms of our identity. It's when we really start developing our identity, when we start really finding out who our friends are, and who we want around ourselves,
Yeah.
what are our passions, what are our interests. And sex becomes something that becomes a potential interest for the majority of teenagers at the time, for the majority of
Yes.
at least it becomes an expectation for the majority of male teenagers at that particular time frame.
Yeah.
And so whilst there is a touch more maturity that might help better understand certain events and better understand certain concepts, I think we have to rest on the idea of the power that is exercised by someone taking advantage of us. And that is the case not only for adults. So we are currently working on a study in which we are seeing a lot of minor against minor sexual violence
Right.
in a data set. And so one might ask, well, where's the power imbalance there?
Okay.
Well, the circumstances tell us about the power imbalance, because a lot of the children might have challenges from a learning and intellectual disabilities or cognitive issues. There might be a lot of mental health issues that are undiagnosed, for example, at the time of the abuse, and they become evident after when they report. There might be situations for the minor perpetrator, actually, in which there is quite
Yeah.
a lot of abusiveness in their family, and a lot of neurodevelopmental issues and play there. So
Yeah.
a very roundabout way of saying that the challenges experiences by teenagers, or at those teenagers here, are certainly of equal severity and gravity. Well, gravity, yeah, they are very, very serious because of all of this, because of this crucial and critical developmental stage in one's life, particularly when it comes to identity. I think it's so important.
Okay. So I think I was wrong in saying that if you're 13, 14, 15, 16 as a teenage boy, you're kind of less vulnerable because you're more developed, mature.
It depends where you draw the lines in terms of vulnerability, right? Because
Right.
so if you're from a purely, if in terms of being attacked by someone,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
physical attack by someone,
Yeah.
a 10-year-old is more vulnerable than a 14,
Okay.
15, 16-year-old,
Okay.
right?
Yes.
Sure. But there's so much more. And this is why we need to move away from the image of sexual violence as a forceful attack from a bigger person than the
Yes.
victim who overpowers the other. Because whilst that might be the case in some circumstances, and that might be the story for some survivors, it's often a combination of a variety of coercion, control, power, opportunity,
Mm,
uh, impaired capacity, that all come together to combine trust towards that person,
yeah.
that all come together to allow they all come together to put the victim in a position where the perpetrator attacks,
Yeah.
assaults
Yes.
them,
Yes.
violates them, abuses them, takes advantage of them.
Yeah. Are you working with people who have gone through this in person only, or are you also working with people who have been exploited online?
Ooh, great question. I trying to think if I've come across anyone who had experiences of, so like image-based sexual violence,
Image
or
based, or
revenge
they've
porn,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
all that sort of stuff. I can't
Which
think of a specific.
I'm going to say, like, these links that I get through on my DMs, like that pornographic links. Who knows what's behind those?
Mhm.
I always think they've got to be targeting males over females, because males are going to be, in general terms, more likely to be enticed by that imagery and click the links. So I'm just wondering. Um,
So I don't have direct
yeah.
one-to-one experience with survivors of online-based sexual
Okay.
violence. There's so many different
Yes.
labels for it. I think it's one of the reason why it's technology-facilitated sexual
Okay.
violence. That again, those umbrella terms that try to capture everything at the same time. But reports that I'm coming across do highlight that men are. Again, the gender differences are really interesting when it comes to the type of violence that men are exposed to, particularly when it comes to young boys, young men in the adolescent years, being coerced to share, for example,
Yeah.
intimate images of themselves, and then being exploited to financial gain with, essentially exploited and threatened to release the
Mhm.
images. And so, yeah, the online world has added a whole new dimension to
Yeah.
sexual violence, one that we will have to come to terms. Well, we are coming to terms with
Yeah.
very, very quickly, because there are the opportunities for offenders to access vulnerable people has dramatically increased.
Yeah. I agree completely. With
Which, I mean, if I can take this opportunity, I mean, it speaks to how, as adults and as parents, we have to be extra vigilant and responsible, and having those responsible adult conversations with the younger people in our families, in our social environment, to about responsible use of social media, because
Mm,
of all of this violence that can be perpetrated, can be experienced, and which has a wide range of effects. So it's not about patronizing children, because I think
mm.
they can use those tools far better than we can, and they probably understand them far better than we can, because
Yeah.
they lived in a world in which they exist,
Yeah.
whereas we live in a world in which they appeared
Yeah.
almost out of
Yeah.
thin air, right?
Yeah.
And so we can't patronize them and treat them as just as children, and it's not, and that's never an effective strategy, is there, as a parenting strategy. But having those adult and responsible conversation is probably something that, as parents, as brothers, as sisters, as grandparents, we need to start having
Love
pretty
it.
quickly.
And I'm all for that. Have you got any more advice to the many parents that will be listening to this, by the way? That's a large part of my audience. You got any advice for how they would go about communicating with their boys, their sons? You could pick any age group that you wish. I know the thing that you've just talked about is something that I'm always preaching when I do parent
Yeah.
talks, about the patronizing thing, like not talking down to them about this topic.
Mhm.
Talk to them on a level. Dr. Emily Setti is somebody who taught me about that, and I think it's completely true. So everything
Yeah.
you just said, I feel is just completely true. You got any other advice, tips, or anything else you want to say to parents?
I don't know if I'm in the right position to advise anyone on how to do things, other than the fact that the only thing I can say is that the most effective conversations that I've had with anyone, it doesn't matter of
Mhm.
age, is this idea of being transparent, being honest, and being responsible with the words that you use.
Perfect.
And it might have come across. I try to avoid generalizations as much as possible, and I try to preface everything that I say by highlighting that every experience will be unique. and it's not just a a saving face
Mm.
approach. It's because it's what I've come across. It's really really hard to put people in a box, and so when it comes to talking about two boys in particular, we are again living in a world where the we're led to believe that certain figures are worth following. I mean, Andrew Tate comes to mind as a particular figure where all the conversations that all the challenges that I had to stereotypical views of masculinity, he probably would disagree, or
Mm. Mm.
that movement of masculinity would not be particularly in agreement with me. You
Mm.
know, the only thing that I can say in that regard is having honest conversations around our feelings, our emotions, our mental health, and consent, and what consent means.
Yes.
It's a very important conversation to have as responsibly as possible and as early as possible. It doesn't have to be about sex if
Yes.
you want to have those conversations early on, because consent is not just about sex. It's
Mm.
about our. There was a teacher when I was in secondary school, talking about other stuff. He used to say that my rights end as soon as yours begin. And so there is this idea that as soon as each other's rights meet each other, that's where our duties and responsibilities start.
Brilliant.
And so this idea of being responsible to the other individuals in your world, in your social world, it's a relatively similar concept to what we talk about when we talk about consent. Consent is about respecting each other's boundaries and respecting the intimacy that we are allowing each other to
Mm.
engage with.
Mm.
And so I think those are the real conversations that can help foster an environment in which there are less stereotypes around being a man, less stereotypes around being what a victim means, and who can be a victim and who can't be a victim.
Mm.
And I mean, whoever is going to listen to this podcast, I am glad that they will potentially come out of this learning that men can also be victims of sexual
Yeah.
violence. And
100%.
if that is a lesson that comes out of it, then perhaps it's a lesson that can be brought forward to the children in their life and the young adults and boys in their lives,
Yeah.
in terms of this stuff happens also to people like us. And so we need to recognize that we might come across people who have these experiences and have that listening ear, willing to listen.
And I think that's a great place for us to finish because that is also what I hope and I am confident will come out of this. That
Great.
you know that males also can be victims, are victims. They also suffer through this after a crime like this comes to their life, and they should be treated with sensitivity, encouragement, empowerment too, and we should take it very, very seriously.
Yeah,
And the crime of male on male sexual violence can happen. Of course, we understand how it could happen in someone's childhood, but it can happen in their adolescence too, and it can happen in their adulthood too. And I think we covered
absolutely.
all of those areas very nicely.
Absolutely.
So, Ken, thank you so much for your time.
I do have a one last thing,
Oh,
perhaps,
yes,
to
please.
add, which is something that just came to mind, is that I always want to avoid creating a dynamic in which we overlook females, focus on men, or focus on female, then overlook men, because that should never be the outcome of any of these conversations,
Mm,
which is why I'm doing the work with marginalized groups,
right.
because of this idea that if it happens to someone, however big the percentage is, they should be equally important in our eyes, because it's
Yes.
still about, whilst the numbers might be different, there may be more perpetrators who focus on female victims or more perpetrators who focus on male boys, for example. Those are the different groups who are more overrepresented across adults and children. It's still about the society, that the social and cultural aspects that allow this type of violence to happen. And so focusing on that should, I hope, help improving and raising awareness for both female, male, or whatever other identities of
So,
victims.
actually, what we're focusing on is sexual violence happens
It does.
and it
Yes.
doesn't escape anyone,
No.
wherever you're from, Wherever you're coming from, whatever angle you are, whatever situation in life you are, whatever age you are, it doesn't escape you.
I mean, just to give you a quick stat, disabled women, I think, are either 2 or 3 times on the proportion,
Yeah.
right? Of how many disabled women are there? In proportion, there are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence
Wow.
than an able-bodied
Wow.
or whatever other
Yes.
definition you want
Yes.
to use woman, and so that is overlooked. We
Mm,
don't talk about that stuff,
mm,
and that is a marginalized group
mm.
within a group that is thought to be represented and visible and seen in our
Yes.
society. But there
Yes.
are so many different ways of being, and there are so many different life characteristics. Not only gender is just one
Yes.
dimension.
Yes.
There is our physical conditions and situations. There is our ethnicity. There is our socioeconomic status. There
Mm.
is whether we are in a single relationship or not. There
Yes.
is whether we have parents or we haven't been brought up. So there's so many different characteristics that prevalence is not a particularly useful thing to
Mm,
think about. It's more about recognizing the environment in which this type of violence happens
mm, mm.
and how many ever targets are out there.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a lifetime of work ahead of
Yes.
us.
Yes.
There's enough work for three or four. There's enough work for many lifetimes.
There is. There is.
100%, because I'm pretty sure you find this in your work too. Every time you kind of make some kind of mini discovery or light bulb moment, it just opens another three or four.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much. If anyone would like to read more on the papers that you've published, are they available?
Yeah, almost all my papers are freely available on the various search engines
Yes.
for research paper. I have a LinkedIn profile. I have a ResearchGate profile where all my papers are published. And so I'll be sure to share those links with you.
Brilliant. And we will put them in the show notes. So thank you for everybody that's joined this podcast. I hope you found it valuable and insightful, and I'll see you again for another one. Thank you. Thank you, Ken.